My father taught me the world was simple, builders and breakers. But one innocent question in a grocery store shattered that truth and forced me to confront a lifetime of lies. The world, my father used to say, is a simple place if you're willing to see the truth. He'd say it while cleaning his hunting rifle at the kitchen table, the smell of gun oil and stale coffee filling our small house. There are builders, he'd grunt, his eyes narrowed in concentration. And there are breakers. Our people, we're builders, always have been. You remember that? I did remember. I was 42 years old and I still lived by his simple truths. They were the load-bearing walls of my life, the foundation on which everything else was built. They made the world make sense. I was in the express checkout lane at the grocery store, the one for 15 items or less, and my jaw was clenched so tight my teeth ached. I had a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, and a frozen pizza. 3 items. The woman in front of me, however, seemed to be engaged in a complex feat of engineering. Not a simple transaction. She was black, with intricate braids woven with gold thread, and she was trying to pay with a combination of crumpled coupons, a government assistance card, and a handful of loose change. She was slowly counting out on the counter. The line behind me was growing, and a low, collective sigh seemed to ripple through the air. My father's voice echoed in my head. Breakers. They don't respect anyone's time. Always an excuse, always a problem. It wasn't hate, I told myself. It was just an observation, a pattern I'd seen my whole life. I shifted my weight, letting the pizza box bump into the metal bar behind her, a little passive-aggressive nudge. She didn't turn around. Her focus was entirely on the pile of coins. The cashier, a young kid with pimples and a vacant expression, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Come on, I muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. My voice was a low growl, thick with impatience. Some of us have places to be. She stiffened. I saw her shoulders rise and fall in a slow, deliberate breath. Without turning to look at me, she said to the cashier, I'm sorry, I'm almost there. Just another $1.27. $1.27. I could feel my blood pressure rising. I could have paid for her entire cart, and it wouldn't have made a dent in my wallet, but it was the principle of the thing, the inefficiency, the sheer lack of preparedness. It was, to me, a perfect example of everything that was wrong. I let out another louder, more pointed sigh. Unbelievable. That's when it happened. A tiny head, adorned with 2 bright pink hair bubbles, peeked around the woman's hip. It was her daughter, a little girl no older than 5, with wide, curious eyes the color of dark chocolate. She'd been standing there silently the whole time, clutching a small, worn-out teddy bear, but now she was looking straight at me. She wasn't looking at me with fear or anger or any of the emotions I might have expected. She was just looking, observing. Her mother finally finished counting the change, slid it across the counter, and began bagging her groceries with a quiet, dignified fury. She was pointedly ignoring me, creating a wall of silence between us. But the little girl didn't. She took a small step forward, her little light-up sneakers flashing red and blue against the grimy linoleum floor. Her gaze never left my face. I felt a strange prickle on the back of my neck. I tried to stare her down, to give her the same cold, dismissive look I gave everyone else, but it was like trying to intimidate a butterfly. Her innocence was a kind of armor. Her mother grabbed the last plastic bag and took her daughter's hand. Come on, sweetie, let's go. But the little girl didn't move. She just stood there, rooted to the spot, her little brow furrowed in concentration. She was still looking at me, her head tilted slightly. I expected her to say something rude, to parrot something she'd heard from her mother. I braced myself for it. Instead, her tiny voice cut through the beeping of the cash register and the low murmur of the other customers. It was clear and pure, with no malice in it at all. It was just a question. A single, simple question that hit me with the force of a physical blow. She looked at her mother, then back at me, and asked, in a voice that was far too loud for the space between us, "Mommy, why is that man so angry?" The world stopped. The cashier froze with his hand halfway to my milk. The woman behind me audibly gasped. The mother's head snapped around, her eyes finally meeting mine, and in them I saw a flash of fear, of exhaustion, and of fierce, protective love. But it was the little girl's face that held me captive. She wasn't accusing me. She wasn't judging me. She was genuinely asking. She saw a simple equation. I was angry, and she wanted to know the reason. She was asking for my truth. And as I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to dismiss her, to justify myself, I realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching horror that I didn't have an answer, not one that I could ever say to a child. My mouth was a desert. All the clever, cutting remarks I kept polished and ready in my mind had evaporated, leaving nothing but dust. I looked from the little girl's impossibly big eyes to her mother's. The woman's face was a mask of weary defiance. She pulled her daughter a little closer, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Then she knelt down so she was at eye level with her child, completely turning her back to me. "Because, baby," she said, her voice soft but clear enough for the entire checkout line to hear. "Sometimes people forget how to be happy, so they try to take a little bit of happiness from everyone else." She smoothed down her daughter's hair. "It's not about us. It's about them. You understand?" The little girl nodded solemnly, her gaze flicking back to me for a second, not with judgment, but with something that looked unnervingly like pity. And that was worse, 1,000 times worse than anger. Pity from a 5-year-old. My father's voice, the one that usually boomed with certainty in my head, was just a faint, panicked whisper. Breakers. Twisting words. Making you the bad guy. But it didn't work. The logic was broken. What had I been trying to build in that moment? What had she been trying to break? She was just a woman trying to buy food for her child. "Sir?" The cashier's voice was timid. "Your total is $8.54. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on my back. My face was burning. I fumbled for my wallet, my usually deft fingers feeling like clumsy sausages. I threw a $10 bill on the counter, my hand shaking slightly. "Keep the change," I mumbled, not looking at him, not looking at anyone. I snatched my 3 items and practically bolted from the lane, the plastic bag crinkling loudly in the ringing silence I was leaving behind. I didn't dare look back. I felt the girl's question following me, clinging to me like a ghost. Why is that man so angry? The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets of my town looked strange, as if I was seeing them through a distorted lens. The frozen pizza on the passenger seat began to sweat, the condensation blurring the picture of a happy, smiling family on the box. What was I so angry about? My father would have had an answer. He would have said I was angry for the slow decay of decency, for the decline of personal responsibility, for the erosion of the world we built. He had answers for everything. They were simple. They were clean. They were wrong. For the first time in my life, that thought didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a terrifying possibility. The anger I'd felt in the store wasn't a righteous defense of principles. It was ugly. It was sour and pathetic. It was the impotent rage of a man shouting at a traffic jam. And a 5-year-old had seen it for exactly what it was. She hadn't seen a builder defending his values. She'd just seen a sad, angry man in a grocery store. When I got home, I put the milk in the fridge and the pizza in the freezer with mechanical movements. The loaf of bread sat on the counter, a bland monument to my failed errand. My house, usually a sanctuary of order and quiet control, felt cavernous and empty. The silence was louder than the noise in the store. It was filled with that one simple question. Why? I walked into my father's old study. He'd passed away 5 years ago, but I'd kept the room exactly as he'd left it. The scent of old paper, leather, and his pipe tobacco still lingered in the air. On the wall hung a framed photo of him and me, both in hunting gear, standing over a fallen buck. He was smiling, proud. I was a boy, maybe 10 years old, trying my best to mimic his stoic expression. This room was the heart of his simple truths, the place where they were forged, and I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to smash it all to pieces. My eyes scanned the bookshelves, filled with history books and biographies of great men, builders, he called them. Then my gaze fell on the heavy oak desk, specifically on the bottom right drawer. It was the only one he ever kept locked. He'd told me it was just old financial records, nothing important. But he always carried the key on his person, a small ornate brass key he kept separate from all the others. After he died, I'd found the key in a small envelope in his safe, labeled simply, "My desk." I'd never opened the drawer. It felt like a violation of his last piece of privacy. But the little girl hadn't asked her mother why the world was unfair. She hadn't asked about builders or breakers. She had asked why I was so angry. The question was personal, and I realized, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, that maybe the answer was personal too. Maybe the foundation I'd built my life on wasn't solid rock. Maybe it was just a carefully constructed lie. With trembling hands, I retrieved the key from the safe in the closet. The metal was cold against my sweaty palm. I walked back to the desk, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a stiff, grinding click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. I pulled the handle and the heavy drawer slid open, revealing not a stack of dusty financial records, but a single, thick, leather-bound photo album I had never seen before in my life. The album was heavy, its dark brown leather cracked with age. There was no title on the cover, no inscription, just smooth, worn leather that felt strangely warm to the touch. I lifted it out of the drawer and placed it on the polished surface of the desk, a foreign object in a room where everything had its designated place. For a moment I just stared at it, a knot of dread and morbid curiosity tightening in my gut. This was my father's secret. The one thing he felt the need to lock away from the world, and from me. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and old secrets, and opened the cover. The first page was a shock. It wasn't a photograph, but a yellowed newspaper clipping, carefully glued to the black paper. The date was October 12th, 1968. The headline read, "Local activist arrested during sit-in protest," and below it was a grainy, black and white picture of a group of young people being led away by police from the lunch counter of a department store. In the center of the photo, a young man with a full head of dark hair and a defiant look on his face was being held by two officers. It took me a second to recognize him. It was my father. He looked no older than 20. He wasn't the stoic, hardened man I knew. He was a radical, a protester, a breaker. My mind reeled. This didn't fit. This wasn't the man who taught me that the world was divided into two simple groups. This was a man actively trying to break the established order. I turned the page, my heart hammering against my ribs. More clippings. University students demand end to segregation. March for equality draws hundreds. And in every article, there he was. My father, Richard Miller, quoted as a student organizer, a passionate advocate for civil rights. Then the photos started. They weren't like the stiff, formal family portraits I knew. These were candid shots, full of life and energy. My father, arm in arm with a diverse group of friends, laughing. My father at a rally, his mouth open, clearly shouting a slogan. And then I saw her, a young black woman with a radiant smile and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and fire. She was in almost every picture with him. They stood close together, his hand often resting on the small of her back, their heads tilted towards each other. In one photo, they were sitting on the grass of a college campus, reading a book together, and he was looking at her with an expression of such pure, unadulterated adoration that it stole the breath from my lungs. It was a look I had never once seen him give my mother. I felt a wave of nausea. Who was this woman? Why had I never heard of her? I kept turning the pages, a frantic, desperate energy propelling me forward. The photos chronicled a story, a love story. Rallies and protests gave way to quiet moments. A picnic by a lake, a shared ice cream cone, a dance at a university function. They looked so happy, so full of hope and a belief that they could change the world. The last photo of them together was dated 1970. They were standing in front of a small, run-down apartment building. He was holding a single key in his hand, and she was on her tiptoes, kissing his cheek. They were building a life together. After that page, she disappeared. The photos became sparse. There was one of my father alone sitting on the steps of that same apartment, his face buried in his hands. Then nothing for a long while. The next dated item was from 1972. It was a formal, engraved wedding invitation for the marriage of Richard Miller, and my mother, Helen. The simple truths my father had preached my entire life suddenly felt like the cruelest kind of fiction. The world he described, the clean, simple world of builders and breakers, was a lie he had constructed. He hadn't been born a builder. He had been a breaker. He had fought against the very system he later championed. The racial animosity, the bitter resentment he drilled into me, where did it come from? It wasn't an inherited belief passed down through generations. It was learned. It was chosen. But why? I flipped to the very last page of the album. There was only one thing on it. Not a photo, but a single folded piece of paper, brittle with age. It looked like a letter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unfold it. It was a birth certificate. The name on it was Samuel Miller. The date of birth was February 4th, 1971. The mother's name was Sarah Washington, the woman from the photographs, and the father's name, listed clear as day in typed black ink, was Richard Miller. My father. My legs gave out, and I sank into his leather chair, the worn document trembling in my hand. I had a brother, a half-brother I never knew existed, and his mother was the black woman my father had loved before he met my mother, the woman he had erased from his life so completely that not even a whisper of her name remained. My mind raced, trying to piece it all together. The anger, the bitterness, the rigid worldview he had built around himself and forced upon me. It was all a wall. A massive, impenetrable fortress he'd constructed, brick by bitter brick, to hide this secret, to hide the man he used to be and the family he had abandoned. My gaze fell back into the now empty drawer. Something was tucked away in the very back corner, almost hidden in the shadows. It was a small, white business card. I reached in and pulled it out. It wasn't a business card. It was an old hospital visitor's pass. St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital? The patient's name was listed as Samuel Washington, and underneath it, in my father's neat, unmistakable handwriting, was a single, cryptic sentence. They blame me for the bad blood. Bad blood. The phrase hung in the stale air of the study, charged with a meaning far darker than a simple idiom. It wasn't just a turn of phrase. My father had meant it literally. St. Jude's, a hospital for children with catastrophic diseases. Samuel Washington. He hadn't taken my father's name. My mind, numb with shock, started to connect the terrible dots. My father, the son of a prominent, deeply prejudiced family. His relationship with Sarah, a black woman, would have been a catastrophic scandal in their world. Then, a child. A sick child. I could almost hear his parents' venomous whispers, twisting a genetic tragedy into a racial curse. They blame me for the bad blood. He had been given a choice, an ultimatum. Cling to the life he was building with Sarah and their ailing son and be cast out completely, or renounce them, return to the fold, and become the man his family demanded. The man I knew. He had chosen the latter. He hadn't just left them. He had betrayed everything he once fought for. His anger, his prejudice, the entire hateful philosophy he'd beaten into me wasn't a belief system. It was an alibi. It was the desperate, lifelong performance of a man trying to justify an unforgivable choice, not just to his family, but to himself. If he could convince himself that the world was truly divided into builders and breakers, that Sarah and their son were somehow part of a lesser group, then maybe his abandonment wasn't an act of cowardice, but one of necessity, of strength. He had spent his life building a prison of hate around himself, and he'd made damn sure I grew up inside it with him. The rage I felt was so immense, so blinding, it almost suffocated me. It wasn't the petty, impotent anger from the grocery store. This was a deep, seismic fury directed at the ghost in the chair, at the man who had fed me poison his entire life to soothe his own guilty conscience. All my life, I had been his shield, the living proof of his new identity. But as the rage crested, it broke, and a profound, aching sadness washed over me. I thought of my brother, Samuel, a boy who had fought for his life in a hospital while his father pretended he didn't exist. Did he survive? Did he know about me? I thought of Sarah, the woman with the brilliant smile, left to face not only her son's illness, but the complete betrayal of the man she loved. and I thought of the little girl in the grocery store with her innocent, devastating question. Why is that man so angry? For the first time, I had the answer. I was angry because I'd been taught to be. I was a vessel for a generation of bitterness I had no claim to. I was the echo of my father's self-hatred. The next few days were a blur of frantic searching. Using the names and dates from the album, I scoured the internet. I found an old obituary for Sarah Washington. She had passed away 10 years ago from cancer. She had been a respected teacher, a beloved member of her community. There was no mention of a husband, but she was survived by her son, Dr. Samuel Washington. A doctor. My brother had lived. And he was a doctor. I found the website for his practice, a pediatrics clinic, in a town 3 hours away. A clinic that specialized in hematology, the study of blood. The irony was so thick it was hard to breathe. I sat in my car for a full hour outside his clinic, the photo album on the passenger seat. What was I going to do? Drive away and try to forget? Let the lies continue? No. The little girl in the store had asked, why? And she deserved an honest answer, even if she never heard it. I deserved it. I walked in. The waiting room was bright, filled with colorful drawings and anxious parents. I gave my name to the receptionist and said I was a relative who needed to speak with Dr. Washington about a family matter. He came out a few minutes later. He was tall, with kind, intelligent eyes, Sarah's eyes, and a warm, easy smile that did nothing to hide the faint lines of exhaustion around them. He looked at me with polite confusion. "I'm Mark Miller," I said, my voice hoarse. "Richard Miller was my father." His smile vanished. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a guarded, painful recognition. He knew who I was. "I see," he said, his voice flat. He led me back to his private office. We sat in silence for a moment, the gulf of 40 years and a lifetime of lies between us. Finally, I pushed the leather album across his desk. "I found this," I said. "I didn't know." He opened it, his long surgeon's fingers tracing the outlines of his mother's face. He didn't seem surprised, just sad. "My mother told me about him," he said, not looking up. "She never wanted me to hate him. She said he made a choice he thought he had to make. She said he was a good man who got lost." "He wasn't," I choked out. "He was a coward, and he filled me with his poison. He made me like him." Samuel looked up at me then, and his gaze was steady. "He made you his son, but you get to choose what kind of man you are." He told me about his illness as a child, sickle cell anemia, a genetic disease, the bad blood. He told me how his mother had worked 2 jobs to pay for his treatments, how she had filled their small apartment with love and books, and taught him that his worth had nothing to do with the man who had left them. He had become a doctor to help children like him. He had become a builder in the truest sense of the word. We talked for hours. I told him everything. About my father's anger, about the grocery store, about the little girl. When I finished, I felt hollowed out, empty of the rage that had defined me for so long. "That little girl," Samuel said quietly. "She gave you a gift. She showed you the bars of your cage." He was right. On the long drive home, the world looked different again. The colors seemed brighter, the air cleaner. The simple truths were gone, replaced by a complex, messy, and infinitely more beautiful reality. My father had left me a legacy of hate, but he had also, unknowingly, left me a brother. He'd left me a chance to break the cycle. The next day, I went back to the same grocery store. I bought a cart full of food, everything a family could need, and a small, brand-new teddy bear. I paid for it, and then I left the full cart with the manager, along with an envelope. Inside was enough cash to cover a family's groceries for a month, and a simple, anonymous note. It just said, "For the little girl with the pink hair baubles and the brave question. Thank you." I didn't know if they would ever get it, but it didn't matter. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. It was my first day as a builder, not of walls, but of bridges, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't angry. I was free.